As you may have seen, both Jacob Brunton and I are highly critical of the national conservative movement, which I would say the figurehead of that would be Yoram Hazony, the NatCon conferences they've been doing the last several years. And we're highly critical of the American Reformer, which is a website by Protestants that are seeming to imitate the Catholic integralists. These are aligned projects, and so criticism of one typically ends up being criticism of another. I want to make it clear that this is not a personal conflict, that I don't know any of the people that are involved. I've perhaps spoke to them over Twitter once or twice, but the concern is with the ideas that are being advocated. The concern is with the theory of government itself that is being advocated by the American Reformer. So I read this article today from American Reformer. It was published September 15th, 2022. It's by Bradford Littlejohn. It's called Why All Politics is Post-Liberal. And this gets at the question of how much power should the government have? That's the way the question is commonly asked. But I'm going to say, I don't agree with the way that question is asked. It's not really how much power. A more precise way to ask the question would be which powers. Because the powers that the state does have, the government does have, it should have them completely. And the powers that it doesn't, it should not have them completely. So it's a more precise way of describing it. Now, in this article from Littlejohn, he was trying to use Romans 13, the line about the governor as being our servant for our good, to advocate for his view, which is illiberalism. Illiberalism, whether on the more leftist or the more rightist side, either way, what it means is we don't believe that the government should be hands-off. Liberty, right? So classical liberalism. The opposite of classical liberalism is illiberalism. It means we believe that the state and the government have more of a role in shaping society, an active role. And so it goes beyond what Romans 13 describes as punishing the wrongdoer, but it goes also into what they call promoting the good. Now, Romans 13, if you read it carefully, it says praising the good. It doesn't say taxing everybody and creating a project so that everybody can be educated, or creating a project so that everybody can have jobs. So we have a conceptual disagreement here about what is the purpose of government. And I think that they are stretching what Paul says in Romans 13 and what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2. So it goes beyond punishing wrongdoers, and it will likely, if they may not declare it today, but it will likely imply programs to end poverty, those kinds of things. And they compare their understanding of a right government with Thomas Jefferson's. They disagree with Jefferson. So in Littlejohn's article, he quotes Jefferson as saying the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury to my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It either picks my pocket or breaks my leg. This is a common sort of saying from Jefferson. Jefferson advocating the high value of liberty. Littlejohn rejects that. He calls that the pickpocket approach to a government. Government is just there to keep people from picking your pocket, and that's the criteria. That definitely is comparable to the kind of vision that you see in those who advocate for minarchism, or those who advocate for an objectivist approach to government, or those who advocate for keeping the government to a minimum, preserving liberty. Some people call themselves libertarians. I don't think that that's a good name. I don't think it's a good movement overall, because it doesn't have a philosophical foundation. But those that call themselves libertarians and the pro-liberty movement, the constitutional conservatives, the founding fathers for the most part, they all agreed with this understanding that it really was the government's job to keep you from picking pockets. And they were concerned about stretching. Now, in his article, Littlejohn mentions that there are founding fathers that took a more positive view toward government doing positive actions. And so, on the historical point, yes, there were founding fathers who were statists to different degrees. Perhaps not to the degrees that Littlejohn is, but we're not going to dispute that there was a mix of views. It was a time of innovation and change. Now, what does Littlejohn commend? he goes back to some of the early reformers. He looks at Johannes Althusius, an early reformed political theorist. Althusius writes, "The magistrate shall distribute rewards to the upright who properly deserve them." There's a drone going by. So what does this mean? It says, distribute them to those who properly deserve them, in order that the love and desire for virtue might be stimulated, nourished, and retained, among others. Reward is the food, nourishment, and incentive of virtue. So he sees a paternalistic approach of the prince to his people. Then Littlejohn goes on in his article and he praises another early reformer, Martin Bucer. This is what Littlejohn writes. Bucer admonishes the king to promote economic policies that will support as many free laborers as possible. Why? Because good jobs will lead to population growth. So it's this approach of let's make more Christians. And it's the prince's job to make sure that our population grows and that the population of good men grows and that we show them what is good. Now, part of Littlejohn's article I will agree with. That is that if you have a morally good person as the prince or the leader or the president, you're going to have people imitating them, and that is a good thing. So I'm not going to deny that aspect of his article. And he even calls it, say, a humble vision. A humble vision is that you would have morally good people in leadership, and that would help inculcate moral goodness within the society. Of course, what Christian could dispute that? That we should have good leaders that even talk from time to time about what is good and what is evil. Great. But when it comes to the philosophical foundations, that's where I'm going to disagree with Littlejohn. Because within his philosophical framework, he has a place for taxing and then creating huge public works projects. I don't. That is the difference. So let's get to this issue of what should the government have the power to do. How much power we talked about, right? But it's not how much, it's which. Which power? That's the right way to ask the question. Well, the Bible tells us a lot about this issue. The Bible doesn't set out to be the authority, it doesn't set out to be the source on what is a good government. That's not the Bible's position, but everything it does say is authoritative, and it is true, and we need to recognize it. And so let's listen to what the Bible has to say about this, and let's compare it to the vision that we got from those early reformers and to the vision that we got from Littlejohn himself. So the Bible tells us where the respective powers should lie in a society. The inference that I get from my reading of the Bible is that a man has the power over his own life unless he violates the rights of others. You think of Naboth and his vineyard, or you think of different accounts in the Bible where there was an injustice done. What was the injustice? Well, it was the violation of their property. Property is key to individual rights. So a man has the power over his own life unless he violates the right of others and his own property. And that is found in the Old Testament civil laws. It's not hard to find that principle there. So you ask yourself, where do you find it? Where do you find absolute, inviolable individual rights in the Bible? Well, you find these in Exodus 20:13 and 20:15. You shall not murder and you shall not steal. Shall not murder and you shall not steal. Just notice how many times throughout the Bible when there was a collective action from the people that people donated willingly, but they were not forced to. Nobody was put in jail because they didn't donate money to build the tabernacle. It was the people's choice. But what we have from the conservative statists today is the idea that no, the government's job, and of course the government is the agent of force that wields the sword, is to expropriate. That is the implication of their view. That is why we differ with them. Now we see what the government should do all the way back in Genesis 9:6. I'd say this is the first time you have an explicit teaching in the Bible about what people should do to other people when rights are violated. Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. So that is a mandate that whoever lives in this society, especially whoever has influence, needs to make sure that the blood is shed. The murderer must be killed. That is justice. That is the kind of thing that we see in the Bible that we are told to use force to do. That's the paradigm. It starts out with murder because people have a right to their life. But then it also is going to go to things like do not steal because people have a right to their property. That's an extension of their right to their life. Now, how do you implement that? Well, Genesis 9:6 doesn't tell us. But when you have a society forming, like ancient Israel under Moses, you do find a principle for how that's going to be implemented, and this gives us indications about what the extent of that power should be. So pay close attention. Exodus 18:21. This is Jephthah talking to Moses. Is it Jethro? I don't remember. I need to look up because I always mix up those two names. I think it's Jethro. Yeah, Jethro talking to Moses. So he says in Exodus 18:21, "Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, who hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and of tens." Now the purpose of this, if you remember the narrative, is that Moses was judging between the people. People were making a long line and coming up to him and saying, "We have a conflict and we need you to intervene here. We need you to judge between me and my neighbor." So if that's what those judges that they were going to set up were doing, that is not the same as putting those people in charge of setting up a system of taxation, a system of public works. No, it was a system of judging between the conflicts that come up naturally. This is consistent with Ayn Rand's theory of government, where the governors are responsible for bearing the sword, but also for stating objectively what is illegal. And so therefore, when a law has been violated, people can know. They can know ahead of time that there was going to be a violation. And then there's a system of courts of some kind. Also, of course, the government is going to be responsible for a military. So we have police, courts, military. That's the extent of what the government ought to be doing. As far as its use of the sword. It doesn't mean that the governor cannot, like Little John would say, talk about goodness and say to the people, this is what goodness is, and praise people. Of course, that's part of Romans 13. Praising the good we agree with. But we don't agree with funding the good. That's a little different, isn't it? So that was in Exodus 18:21. And notice there's other really important criteria about who should be ruling other people. Look for able men from all the people, men who fear God. There's probably 6 or 7 different points that you could notice in this passage. It needs to be men who are from the people, not foreigners, not people that are geographically distant from them, but people that know the people that they're ruling. They need to be men, they need to fear God, be trustworthy, hate a bribe, and then they're going to be organized in a hierarchy. There's other points that we could draw from that. But you find this individual rights is the purpose of this structure that's being built. And this is consistent throughout all Scripture. So think of 1 Peter 2:14, which says, governors are sent by God to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. It's almost identical to Romans 13. You find inviolable individual rights. Notice Romans 13, 3-4. It gives the governor exactly the same rules as 1 Peter. Punish those who do evil, praise those who do good. Not reward those who do good, contrary to what John MacArthur recently wrote in his letter to Gavin Newsom. This is an embarrassing error to read the word praise and then to insert the word reward. I can see why it might have accidentally slipped in because we know that God is the rewarder of those who do good. So perhaps just the term reward accidentally entered into his mind. But this is the kind of thing that's happened over and over again as I've been reading people discussing Romans 13. So I've begun to wonder if everybody is just that uncareful or if there are some people in this discussion who know what they're doing and they're trying to obfuscate. It's to praise those who do good. Praise, okay? For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. Now they're going to take that phrase, God's servant for your good, and they're going to make much of it. But you notice, it doesn't say he's God's servant to reward those who do good. He's already described exactly what the serving involves. It involves being a terror to evil, and it involves being somebody who praises the good. So, I suppose if you already had other reasons to think that God wanted the prince to go about rewarding and taxing and all these different things, then you could make a case that this passage does not prohibit it. But you're not going to find that idea taught in this passage. You have to distinguish that. It just says praise. All right, and then he goes on. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Now notice how much Paul discusses that. Relative to everything else he said, he's gone into great detail about exactly what the role is of this prince. And so I think we should take that emphasis as a clue that this is how he sees the prince. And he hasn't said anything about the other things that Little John might advocate. Now, you find inviolable individual rights in many of the passages describing the things that people have the right to, like the right to their property that's mentioned in Acts 5:4. While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal, says Peter. This idea of the right to the property, it's assumed throughout Scripture. Ownership means the ability to dispose of a thing as you choose. Consider Matthew 20:15a. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? And notice the person in that parable is standing in for God. But it's also in the parable, it's a man, and the man says, I have the right to do what I want with my own money. That is inconsistent with the vision of collectivism and statism. It's inconsistent with the totalitarian ideologies, but it's also inconsistent with the minor welfare state ideologies. If people do have the ability to do what they want with their own money, you're going to have a society that recognizes inalienable property rights. Many other passages likewise support this idea of individual rights, inviolable rights to possessions. For instance, consider if there were no such a right, if needs really did constitute just claims on others the way Timothy Keller thinks. Could Paul have really said in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat? If the state was designed as a tool to end poverty, could Jesus have said in Matthew 26:11, the poor you will always have with you? If it were God's will for the state to redistribute personal property of individuals in this generation to make up for wrongs committed in prior generations, could God have said in Ezekiel 18:20, the child shall not share the guilt of the parent? If God were pleased by the state taxing people and doing great projects to, quote, help the nation, to make sure that there are more people, a higher population, jobs for everyone, everyone's educated, everyone's healthy, everyone's fed, everyone's sheltered. If this were the vision of the Bible, then why did Samuel have such a disdain for what the future kings of Israel were going to do when he described them as taking a mere tenth of the people's grain and of their vineyards and giving it to his officers and his servants? Samuel goes on about how bad this is going to be, and notice it's only a tenth. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. So he considers that to be slavery. The fact that they have to do what he says, that he's going to probably put some kind of regulations on what kind of work they can do and how much they can sell for and how much they can buy for and what they have to create, and he's going to be taking 1/10 of their income. Slavery. There is no doubt that in the United States we are tax slaves. And the national conservatives don't seem to have a problem with this. They want to de-emphasize that in their platform. Well, Samuel goes on, and in that day you will cry because of your king whom you yourselves have chosen. So, give us a king, give us a king. This is the cry of people always. And it is the cry of the leftists who have twisted moral systems, and they want their king to impose that. But it's also the cry of these illiberal rightists who perhaps are better on the topic of social conservatism. In fact, they're a lot better. I wouldn't deny that. But they still are crying the same thing, give us a king, the same method. And the method is the problem. If you try to achieve the right outcome by the wrong method, you will not get there. So consider how Samuel's words came true. Not too many generations later, Solomon made use of forced labor to the point that the people rebelled against his son. So in 1 Kings 12:4, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. Not too many generations from Samuel's warning to Solomon's poor choices. And then Rehoboam losing the 10 tribes. If individual property rights were not inviolable, why would the Bible speak of the maintenance of such rights as the essence of justice? Why would it speak of the denial of such rights as the essence of oppression and injustice so many times, so thoroughly? Let's just do a little preview of some of them. Psalm 82:3 cries to us that rights should remain inviolable. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, it says. Likewise, in Isaiah 10:1-2, it considers the violation of property rights to be a form of wicked plunder and spoil. Woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record unjust decisions so as to deprive the needy of justice, and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans. If you think that rights are a new idea, why are they in the Bible? All these passages are telling us that God cares more about justice than about what your wealth redistribution scheme can accomplish. Now, does God care more about justice for the poor than for the rich? No. Consider Exodus 23:3-6. God cares about procedure. So, don't be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Do not pervert the justice to your poor in his lawsuit. So partiality in either direction, toward the rich or toward the poor, is prohibited. Possessions matter. National conservatives, Yoram Hazony, William Wolfe, Aaron Wren, all these guys that are responsible for these conferences and movements and podcasts and Twitter spaces and blogs, possessions matter. Is there a role for that principle, that foundational biblical principle and American principle in your project? I'm not saying I hate you and want to destroy your reputation, and I'm certainly not ever going to try to lie about you. I'm just trying to ask you, see this. Open your eyes to the value of this. Possessions matter, and the government is in a position to be able to dispossess people of their possessions, but it must not do so. Ezekiel 45:9, thus says the Lord God, enough, you princes of Israel, put away violence and destruction, and practice justice and righteousness. Stop your expropriations from my people, declares the Lord God. I assume that these princes were expropriating in order to do something of, quote, public good. They don't just expropriate without doing some kind of window dressing on why they have to do it and why it's important. And God says no. You cannot love your neighbor by using the state to do to him the things God forbids. Take that seriously. I will share a final passage, Leviticus 19:13-15. It makes God's standards clear. It says, do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. And so justice in God's eyes is this fair judging of all based on objective standards, not partiality, not affirmative action, and prohibiting people from putting things in front of others that would hurt them, like a stumbling block to a blind person. That's certainly an active violation of that person's sovereignty as a person. Do we think we can do better than this vision that we find in the Bible? William, do you think we can do better? Why does anyone think that the principles of God should be ignored by a just government? That's the question that I pose to you, and you better have a really good answer, because we're going to keep on asking.